The binding of a standard U.S. National Park Service safety ledger is made of treated split calf skin, dyed a dull government tan, that doesn't show grease from field rations, with a gray film of limestone dust. It has a specific smell when you open it in an enclosed space: tallow, dry linen thread, and the bitter vinegar bite of high-stability iron gull ink. I sat at the steel desk in the basement vault of the Jewel Cave National Monument Administrative Annex, checking the serial numbers on my primary cell pack. The room smelled of damp blueprints and low-voltage air filtration. To my left sat the modern ruggedized digital tablet the regional director had pushed on us during the spring quarter reset. It remained dark. A lithium screen can glaze over if it takes a 40-foot drop down a wet chimney, or the firmware can drop its cache during a localized electromagnetic shift. Ink doesn't cache. If a line is drawn in an official ledger with a 0.5 millimeter technical pen, that line exists as a legal document until the paper burns or the rock rots. I flipped to the back index of the 2018 regional log. My thumb stopped at the gray tab for Sector 4, case file 18-094, unauthorized recreational spelunking entry. 4 names were lined out in red ink, denoting a non-recovery closure. They were students from the School of Mines at Rapid City, who had tried to bypass the outer karst gate on a Tuesday night in October, when the limestone was slick with snowmelt. They had come to my office at 5 o'clock, their clothes smelling of cheap beer and damp denim, asking for an after-hours geological sampling variance. I had denied the permit. I didn't look up from my ledger when I did it. I simply cited CFR Title 36, Section 2.1, concerning the structural stability of unmapped limestone pillars after a seasonal freeze. They went around the perimeter fence anyway. They dropped down an unmarked air shaft 3 miles north of the visitor center. When the regional rescue team finally located the squeeze 4 days later, the ceiling had dropped 18 inches during a thermal settlement. The subsequent internal inquiry had lasted 6 months. The lawyers from Denver went through my logs with an industrial optical scanner, looking for a loose date, an uninitialed hour, or an ambiguous safety warning. They found nothing. Every entry was a perfect wall of regulatory cross-references. The department cleared me of administrative liability before the summer season opened. My union rep told me I had handled the situation with exemplary clinical detachment. I closed the 2018 book, the calfskin cover shutting with a heavy flat slap that echoed off the concrete vault walls. My hands were dry. I picked up my state-issued LED headlamp, a heavy, anodized aluminum cylinder with a double-sealed gasket, and clicked it onto my helmet. Next came the barometric altimeter, its brass needle calibrated to the morning's surface pressure at 5,320 feet above sea level. I checked the toggle switch on the emergency VHF radio at my belt. The green pilot light blinked once every 4 seconds, indicating a full load on the alkaline cells. I signed my own solo descent authorization form on the clipboard by the vault door. Marcus Thorne, Chief Safety Auditor. Objective, Deep-Level Structural Compliance Review, Compartment 7. When I walked out into the access tunnel, the transition was simple. The administrative office ended at a reinforced steel security door set directly into the natural Mississippian limestone wall. I inserted the 4-inch brass key, turned the deadbolt until the gears groaned, and stepped through. The vertical steel ladder dropped 60 feet into the dark before the first transition ledge. I hooked my safety lanyard into the guide wire, clicked my headlamp onto the low 300 lumen setting, and began my descent into the karst. By 2 in the afternoon, I was 3 miles south of the public boardwalks, well below the level where the air handling systems could shift the humidity. Jewel Cave isn't like the wet caverns of Kentucky or the deep, smooth river tubes of New Mexico. It is a dry, claustrophobic maze, a dense 3-dimensional grid of intersecting fissures where the stone has been eaten away by ancient sulfuric acid until the rock resembles a sponge. The walls are coated in dog-tooth calcite spar, millions of sharp, amber-colored crystal needles that grow out of the dark limestone like broken glass. If you slip out here, the rock doesn't bruise you. It cuts through canvas coveralls like a rasp. The air had turned thick, cold, and entirely stagnant. They had that distinct mineral rot smell, the scent of ancient iron deposits that haven't seen an oxygen molecule since the place has seen. I stopped at a historical survey marker, a brass disc set into the floor by a U.S. Geological Survey team in 1978. I sat down on my pack, unbuckled the leather safety ledger from my chest harness, and laid it across my knees. The silence here was a physical weight against my eardrums, a high, thin ringing that happens when the auditory nerve realizes there hasn't been a vibration in the air for an hour. Every scratch of my steel pen against the unlined paper sounded like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. Timestamp 11:15 a.m. Survey marker 78B. Depth metric 640 feet below surface baseline. Structural settlement 0. Calcite spar stability optimal. I closed the book, the sound sharp against the stone. To my right, the fissure split into the crystalline conduit, a low, horizontal tube 18 inches high and 30 feet long. The only way through was flat on your stomach, cheek pressed against the damp grit, dragging your gear bag behind you by a nylon leash. I checked the straps on my helmet, pulled my leather gloves tight over my wrists, and slid into the gap. The limestone was cold against my chest, the needle spar scraping against my pack shovel with a dull metallic hiss. The crawlway opened into a dead-end chamber shaped like the inside of a church bell. The ceiling rose 30 feet into a dark dome lined with clusters of dogtooth calcite, some of the crystals as long as my arm form, their amber faces catching the bright white light of my LED headlamp. I stood up, shaking the white limestone dust from my knees, and turned my head to track the perimeter walls for structural fractures. The moment the high-powered beam of my LED lamp hit the large crystal cluster in the center of the dome, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a draft, it was an acoustic vibration, a low, thin hiss like water hitting a hot frying pan. The calcite needles directly in front of my face began to tremble, their geometric faces sparkling with an unnatural fluid velocity that made my eyes water. A voice came out of the stone. It didn't sound like an echo. It didn't sound like a radio transmission through a speaker. It was a high-fidelity, dry playback that came directly from the mineral veins of the wall. The sound sharp and immediate. Timestamp 14:30, the stone voice said. The cadence was precise, clinical, and completely free of regional accent. It was my voice. Total primary light failure in Sector 4, structural acoustics deteriorating. Requesting surface tracking variants. I stopped breathing. The ringing in my ears came back, twice as loud as before. I reached down and gripped the brass bezel of my watch. The hands were mechanical, driven by a jeweled movement that I calibrated every Sunday morning against the Naval Observatory clock in the office. It was 11:30 a.m. The voice that had just come out of the calcite spar was using my badge number's operational vocabulary, but I hadn't spoken those words. I hadn't even thought them. The entry didn't exist in my current ledger. "Who's down here?" I called out. My voice sounded small, flat, and instantly choked by the damp limestone walls. "This is Chief Auditor Thorne. You're on an unmapped compliance sector without a safety tether. State your authorization number." The dome stayed silent. The crystals had stopped vibrating, their amber faces dark and cold again under the white glare of my lamp. "What major conscious base patterns came from this? Is it?" I walked to the center cluster, my boots clicking hard against the flowstone floor. I leaned in until my helmet lens was 3 inches from the primary crystal face. There were well wires. No hidden speaker housings from the old 1980s interpretive trails. There was only the solid, unbroken crystalline structure of the stone, fused the bedrock by 300 million years of pressure. My hand was steady when I pulled the safety ledger out of my vest. A professional doesn't guess. He doesn't let his pulse alter his reporting. If there was a radio bleed-through from the surface team, some new high-frequency digital array the tech crews were testing on the northern range, it had to be logged under the Equipment Maintenance Index. I sat down on my gear pack, clicked my steel pen, and turned to the daily log sheet for Sector 6. 11:35 a.m., I wrote. Acoustic anomaly detected at bottom of crystalline conduit. Calcite spar cluster emitting high-frequency radio interference, mimicking internal safety vocabulary. Suspect unauthorized digital VHF testing on surface range. As the steel tip of the pen traced the final letter of my signature, the hum returned. It didn't come from the center cluster this time. It came from the floor beneath my thighs. The limestone felt live, vibrating at a low, subaudible pitch that made my jaw ache. I looked down at the paper,